ChatGPT is pretty smart. It can code, write essays, solve complex math equations, and even offer practical business advice. But I want to know if ChatGPT can upgrade the Toyota 2JZ engine. To test this, I'll be asking ChatGPT to give me a parts list that would allow the 2JZ to reliably achieve different horsepower levels, ranging from 500 to 20,000 horsepower. So let's cut right to it and find out how good of a tuner AI really is. So we start by asking some preliminary questions about the 2JZ. Do you know about the Toyota 2JZ engine? Okay, it outputs some pretty good info here, even noting the aftermarket support for the engine and its use in drifting and drag racing. Now let's get a little more difficult. Does the 2JZ utilize a wet or a dry sump oil system? It looks like ChatGPT knows the 2JZ uses a wet sump system, and I'm pretty impressed by that. Alright, now onto the true test. Let's ask ChatGPT to give us a list of parts that will make the 2JZ capable of reliably achieving 500 horsepower. Alright, it looks like we didn't get a parts list, but it's giving us some general info about what components to upgrade, which is a pretty good start. Specifically, it wants an upgraded turbo, fuel system, ECU, intercooler, exhaust, cooling system, and it also wants a dyno tune. These, of course, are all necessary upgrade areas if you want to make that 500 horsepower reliably, but let's see if we can push it to give us a parts list. Alright, we got our parts list. Let's see if it's accurate though. So for the turbo, it wants us to install a Garrett GTX 3582R, which is the exact same turbo used on the 2JZ in Kalvin Malli's 300ZX, which made 500 horsepower. So yeah, this turbo is going to work no problem. Next, it wants a fuel system overhaul with ID 1300X injectors, a Walbro 450 pump, a Radium Engineering fuel rail, and an Aeromotive FPR. Now for engine management, it wants an AEM Infinity 506, which is certainly not a bad choice and will get the job done just fine. You can use the stock 2JZ ECU at 500 horsepower, but it is pushing the limits of reliability, and it kind of falls on its face after 500 horsepower. It also wants a standard intercooler along with full 3-inch piping, which is a great size for 500 horsepower. Now for the exhaust system, it wants to install a full race exhaust manifold, a 3.5-inch stainless steel downpipe, and an HKS high-power titanium exhaust. Wow, ChatGPT is certainly not cutting any corners on this build. You certainly don't need a fancy titanium exhaust for 500 horsepower, but we never specified a budget, so let's get crazy. Now it lists some engine internals at once here: CP pistons, Manley rods, and ARP head studs. You don't need to upgrade your pistons and rods for 500 horsepower, but I do agree with those ARP head studs. Now for the cooling system, it wants a Koyo radiator along with a Mishimoto oil cooler kit and a Mishimoto aluminum radiator hose kit. I have no idea what an aluminum radiator hose kit is. I'm assuming it meant silicone. Could be the first small mistake here by ChatGPT. The last thing it wants is a dyno tuning session, and that wraps up the 500 horsepower part list. Unfortunately, ChatGPT didn't mention an aftermarket wastegate or any sort of boost control, so those are some points against it here. However, all things considered, ChatGPT killed it at providing that parts list, and I would give it about a 95% accuracy rating. Now let's up the ante and see if it can give us a parts list for 1,000 horsepower. Alright, we got another parts list here. The turbo it wants is a Precision Turbo Pro Mod 88, which is definitely overkill for 1,000 horsepower, and it would be super laggy. Most guys use a 76mm turbocharger for 1,000 horsepower, but hey, I guess going bigger is always better. It also calls for a turbocharger exhaust manifold, either a custom or aftermarket one, and I can't argue there. Now for the fuel system, it wants ID 2000 injectors, dual Walbro 450s, a surge tank, and an upgraded FPR, which will all be great for 1,000 horsepower. Now here's where ChatGPT gets a little questionable. In the parts list, it asks for 2 billet fuel rails. This is odd because one fuel rail would work just fine for 1,000 horsepower. But let's ignore that for now and move on to engine management. ChatGPT wants the Motec M150 ECU, which is a great choice, and there are no problems there. For exhaust, ChatGPT wants a full 4-inch system, which sounds just great to me. Now for the good stuff though, engine internals. It looks like ChatGPT calls for high compression CP pistons, Manley turbo tough con rods, ARP L19 head studs, and upgraded main and rod bolts. Those are all fantastic choices for a 1,000 horsepower build. However, I'm surprised that it didn't want any sort of cylinder head modifications for a reliable 1,000 horsepower setup. Now onto cooling. ChatGPT is calling for a high capacity aluminum radiator, an aftermarket oil cooler, twin electric fans, and also a high flow water pump, which doesn't even exist for the 2JZ. It also wants an electronic boost controller, which certainly adds to the reliability of this build. build. Unfortunately, ChatGPT still left out an aftermarket wastegate, which I'm pretty surprised at, but overall it was still about 90% accurate. But you've been waiting long enough. Let's see if ChatGPT can give us a parts list for 20,000 horsepower. Alright, it looks like ChatGPT did the calculations and came to the conclusion that 20,000 horsepower is not possible on this engine, but it still tried to give us a list anyway.
How did you know how to put this all together?
It's starting us off with a custom engine block, which would absolutely be needed for 20,000 horsepower. I'm not sure its recommendation of aluminum or even titanium would work as a material here though, unless you bore and stroke the motor to some insane amount. It also wants a custom cylinder head with oversized valves and optimized port shapes, which I guess isn't wrong, but I was kinda hoping ChatGPT would completely redesign the cylinder head from the ground up, but hey, it is what it is. Alright, so ChatGPT wants a massive quad turbocharger setup running an insanely high boost pressure, which I guess makes sense. And how about this? ChatGPT is calling for a jet fuel injection system, so basically a fuel system using rocket or jet fuel. Not only that, but it wants us to use liquid nitrogen as the cooling medium for the engine, which would also require a complete cooling system overhaul. For engine management, it's calling for a custom EMS with advanced algorithms and real-time monitor. It sounds like a quantum computer could do the job. ChatGPT said nothing about engine internals, which is pretty disappointing. I was waiting for it to tell us to implement a jet engine into the 2JZ's design or something, but at least it tells us to use a roll cage and safety equipment. Glad to know ChatGPT cares. I just wanted to mention that the highest horsepower Otto cycle engine is a diesel engine that produces over 100,000 horsepower, and it is about as tall as a 3-story building. So 20,000 horsepower is possible out of an engine, but it would need a major redesign and size increase. Anyways guys, thanks for sticking around, and I hope you have a wondrous day. Peace out.